moment she entered the room, an intense feeling came over me. I knew she was the girl I was going to marry. That's how Ernest Hemmingway described his first meeting with Hadley Richardson, the woman who is buried here along with her second husband, Paul Mowrer. Hadley met Hemingway, and Hemingway changed her life. I don't think there's any question about that. They moved to Paris, to make a long story short, and were there during the time that some of the most famous artists of the time during the 1920s, the post-World War I period. The Lost Generation. It's so interesting to read about her and Hemingway having breakfast with James Joyce, hanging around with F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and many others. The intensity of that experience must have been incredible. And the relationship that Hemingway and she had at that time, it was quite obvious that they were very much in love with each other. And I am going to take the liberty of reading a few quotes from the Moveable Feast. I'm lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man. Then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays for you, for Paris is a movable feast. And I think that movable feast stayed with Hadley as well, right up until the end. And in fact, after Hemingway committed suicide, she still expressed no regrets for the time that she spent with Hemingway and for the time she spent in Paris. We ate well and cheaply and drank well and cheaply and slept well and warmed together and loved each other. That's the woman he's referring to, is laying right here. The other thing that I think says a lot about Hadley, and definitely about Hemingway as well, life breaks us all, but some of us get stronger in the broken places. And I don't think there's any question that says a lot about what Hadley was as a person, that she did go through losing Hemingway to one of her best friends after he divorced Hadley, and that she took some time, but she went on to find and make another life with Paul Mowrer, which by all accounts was very happy. One of the things that I was able to access for the writing of this book were the tapes that she made at the end of her life, interviewed by an Alice Hunt Sokoloff, who was a friend of hers. And Hadley really comes off as a very gracious lady. She called herself, what did she call herself? Quite a, oh my, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Quite a knockout, and I think that's true. She was a knockout, I think, both how she looked and how she lived her life. And she does mention later how much she loved Paul and Paul loved her. But I think there's no question that she also definitely loved Hemingway at the time, and that he loved her. Just one more quote. When I saw her again standing by the tracks as the train came by the piled logs at the station, I wished I had died before I had ever loved anyone but her. That was maybe one of the true sentences that Hemingway always wished, or always his goal was to write, because I think he did love her, and I think later in life he admitted that she was the one that he should have stayed with. And she herself, I think, at the end of life, as I mentioned, had expressed no regrets for her time with Hemingway. But I'll let I'll let Bill talk a little bit about Paul and the life that she had after Hemingway, after she was divorced by Hemingway.
Well, Paul was quite the man himself. He was no doubt the equal of Hemingway in many, many ways. He was a great writer, and he was the poet laureate, the very first poet laureate of New Hampshire. He met Hadley in the spring of 1927, which was shortly after she had divorced Hemingway. They had a 5-year courtship. He was married at that time, too. And he did divorce his wife, and they were married in London. Like Hemingway, he was a foreign correspondent, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize for foreign correspondence, the very first time it was awarded. Previous to World War I, he covered the conflict in Croatia, and then during the war, he ran the Chicago Daily News Paris office and covered World War I from there. Incidentally, his brother, Edgar Ansel, also won a Pulitzer Prize for foreign correspondence. I think probably in New Hampshire he is known. Obviously, he was again the first poet laureate,
right.
And that's certainly considering in the long line of poet laureates, and of course, and Frost and before them. I'd like to quote from one of his poems. This is a really nice little book that belongs to Rick, incidentally, and it's a signed copy by Paul. It's called Going to Live in New Hampshire, something that I did.
Yeah.
And the poem, coincidentally, is named I'm Going to Live in New Hampshire. I'm just going to read the last few lines. Homesick with years, I crave to live again, where ruffled grouse drum and chickadees feed by, with men who talk my talk and look my look. New Hampshire's hills, the fir-spired lakes of Maine, henceforth are world enough. There's time to try each game trail now and every trouty brook. That kind of resonates with Rick and I, especially that very last line of every trouty brook. For many, many years we have been devout fly fishermen, and both Paul and Hadley were fly fishermen, like Hemingway. So they carried on the tradition of doing that. I guess the striking thing here is, to me anyway, is how a woman who more or less lived the high life after the war and saw Paris and all of its glory after World War I, and hobnobbed with all the great writers of that era, as well as many of the artists of that era. And yet she found a life with her second husband, Paul, here in the very small little village of Chocorua, New Hampshire, which actually is part of Tamworth. It's kind of a suburb, if you will.
Yes.
Not sure what the population is, but I would guess it's like our hometown, probably right around 2,000 or so. So it's a very, very small town, very picturesque. And I failed to notice before, but right over behind the camera is Mount Chocorua, which just about everybody that ever comes to New Hampshire takes a picture of. It is one of the most beautiful places. And Chocorua is an absolutely beautiful little town. So they found happiness here, and I guess that's what, in the end, like the poet says, that's enough.
It's enough, and I think it's enough for you and I.
Yeah.
I'm very happy that we live here. Just an aside, your wife also was a avid fly fisher person, and I think probably she and Hadley might have gotten along.
Oh, I think
well.
so.
Just one other book I think I should mention. Is a book called The Paris Wife, and that's written by a Paula McLain. And I actually finished that, well, I reread it recently. And the interesting thing about that book is it tells, it's obviously an interpretation, but it tells the story of the Moveable Feast, not from Hemingway's point of view, but from Hadley's point of view. So it's kind of an interesting read to put that together with the Moveable Feast. And we're very happy that we've discovered Hadley ourselves, being here in Chocorua, and that she's in our book, buried New Hampshire. So I think it's probably time to say goodbye. It is getting kind of cool here.
Yes, there's a few snowflakes if you haven't noticed.
But rest in peace, Hadley and Paul.
Rest in peace.